There was a game I've played recently called Gordian Quest. And this is me talking about finishing a game for once. I wouldn't recommend it, and I don't think it has to do with the game being awful in some way. It's got more to do with the main gameplay loop being tedious. Sure, there can be fun moments, customization, deck building, but none of it was good enough to make me care. I realized that I kept firing up a game, loading it in Alt-Tab and forgetting entirely that it's even there. Then playing a few fights and closing it, I had zero interest in progressing. So my complaints. First is the repetition. I like to think of Slay the Spire as a perfect example of length. Although not the same kind of game, so in Slay the Spire you've got a variety of fights, enemies and customization on the way to the heart. Even if an individual fight might not be threatening, it's still possible to take some health damage and make a more difficult fight later on, awfully risky. There could be a group of enemies growing in strength every turn, and a slow defensive deck might barely come out of it, and then fail due to the damage taken. Here Gordian tries to do a similar thing. There are different enemies and there are hazards adding variety to the fights. Also shrines add risk and reward element. Problem is that the enemies are generally very slow, frequently blocking instead of doing damage, and vast majority dies before doing anything. I'd say the damage all around might be a bit too high as well. I've been two-shot and almost one-shot multiple times, but at no point did I fail any of the fights. So all of them feel pointless. Just rush down the enemy and peace out. Over 50% of my fights were without any damage taken. Sure, I am early on, but still, gotta get to the late game, and I put more than 10 hours into it already. It's also very easy to just fight a little and then go and restore health, so any kind of impact from the previous fight gets instantly negated. Honestly, the random events pose the bigger threat as they clog up the deck with exhaustion cards. This is my biggest problem. I wanted to actually have fun, and the game actively swarmed me with boring fights which were all exactly the same. Second is the deck building. So there are 3 schools every character has. I, for example, had a cat guy who has blood magic, curses and something called reaping. So with level ups, a player can go in the talent tree and get a bunch of bonuses, most of which were plus health or plus initiative or something like that. But rarely there are new cards. Problem is that most of these cards do damage, or do damage and apply debuff. Considering I've got 3 characters, I expected some variety. Something special there. Maybe you have some sort of debuff synergy with another character. And there is some, but for example it's, if the target is bleeding, then do slightly more damage. Like 1 in 20 cards is that. And I could barely affect what kind of deck I am getting, aside from slightly reducing my card count. And my team wasn't really a team, it was just 3 guys who happened to want the same guys dead. They barely affect each other at all. Honestly, friendly NPCs in the beginning of the game had more synergy than my guys. Maybe I just picked the wrong kind of team, but it goes to show that something must be terribly wrong if I went for a debuff guy and his effects didn't synergize with anyone else. And there are a lot of cards which are total garbage. For example, there's a, if you're affected by a debuff, then gain slightly more block. Or if you heal targets, a spirit beast, you can also, if you heal targets and the target is a spirit beast, you can also move it anywhere. The value of gimmicky effects like that is way too high for how situational they are, and like I said, fights barely last more than 2 rounds, so they are irrelevant anyway. Third is the story. I have no idea what the story is. There's so much text and it's so generic that I cannot care in the slightest. It seems as simple as a big bad has awoken and he's been summoned by some evil cultists. Deal with it! But there are about 10,000 more words to say that. Not very important, but bears mention. Fourth is the character customization, i.e. gear and talents. Gear is usually very bare bones, but assuming it's because I barely scratched the surface 10 hours in, it's something like +1 dexterity in events. But there are also legendaries I bought which were 3 stats and a card. Problem was that none of it felt like it had an actual effect. I've had my main characters fully decked with multiple legendaries out, and the 3rd character naked, and both of them did roughly the same thing. Roughly as well. The only difference was having weird skills like Blink, which just clogged the deck. Talents are also boring, like I said before, it's mostly just tiny stat boosts, but what was cool was an ability to build a talent tree. A player could snap the branches on and decide to ignore the path opened earlier. That was a pretty cool idea, but still not much of an impact, and it's 3 levels for 1 card which might not even go into the deck because it has no synergy with the rest of it. Frequent problem for my debuff guy. Aside from that, I'd also say that UI isn't too great. It has a lot of clicking. For example, I want to buy an item in the shop. I click it and then I press enter. Nothing happens. Gotta move the mouse. Same for everything. Click here, move, click again. It was so tedious, especially when I was buying a bunch of runes, when I made an auto hotkey script which clicked the confirmation when I pressed E. There are also a lot of menus which seem entirely irrelevant, like sorting through vendors' inventory. Then they have free items. Very useful indeed. In combat also, when I wanna see what the opponent does, it goes into a weird mode which deselects my current character and I need to go back to them. I can't just click right or something. Instead, again, more moving the mouse. There are basically zero convenience options and everything takes more time than it should. So I feel like the game isn't beta, and it isn't. There's some good here, and it can have some things tightened up, maybe becoming great, but overall I'd call it a time waster without much to offer. And now I also wanted to compare it to Darkest Dungeon as well, because I think it's kind of similar to that. One thing Darkest Dungeon has, it has some trash fights, but even those fights can always nail your guy, do some stress damage. They always leave a lasting effect. In Gordian Quest you really don't have any of that. No fight leaves anything behind. Sure, one guy might die, but you just go to a city instantly and resurrect them for like 20 coins. I don't remember the exact price, it doesn't matter. In Darkest Dungeon, the Death Experiment. I think the two games are actually somewhat similar, despite one being a deck builder and now one being more of a roguelike. But the gist is that I don't think this game just does many things well.
More dust, more ashes, more disappointment.